Have a think about all of the lessons we learned about in topic 2, the so-called Cold War crises, the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missiles Crisis, and the invasion of Czechoslovakia. Have a think about all of the tensions, all of the arguments, all of the possible missteps that have happened in the Cold War so far. With all of that in mind, why would America and the Soviet Union want to improve relations by the 1970s? Write down a few ideas and we'll see how good you are at thinking like a superpower leader in a couple of minutes. This lesson, we're going to be thinking about how far the world relaxed in the 1970s. The word relax relates to a French word which historians use to describe this period, known as détente. Literally, it means a relaxation of tensions. So it's a definition we're always going to test you on. It's a definition an exam board would expect you to understand in an exam question. So between around 1969 to 1979, there was a general détente between America and the Soviet Union. Now, some historians would actually go further back, they'd go even before the invasion of Czechoslovakia. You remember last lesson I said, to what extent really was the invasion of Czechoslovakia a crisis? Sure, it was a crisis for the Czechoslovaks, it was a crisis for Eastern Europe, but compared to the Berlin Wall, and in particular the Cuban Missiles Crisis, many historians would argue that actually détente starts with things such as the Hotline or the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1964. But for ourselves and for the example, we're going to focus on 1970 to 1979. So we've got a couple of things to be thinking about. We've got a whole bucket load of vocabulary for you in this lesson. Obviously, we've got détente, but you can see in that vocabulary list there's many different events which you're going to need to have an idea of or very detailed understanding. So apologies for the very content-heavy lesson, but the 1970s are so full of major world events, and we're going to slam them all into around 20 to 30 minutes worth. So well done, guys. I'm so sorry. So, for the leaders during détente, we start out with President Nixon, who was a Republican, hence the little R next to his name. He was president from 1969 to 1974. The eagle-eyed among you will notice that that's a little bit weird for American presidents. A British Prime Minister can last for any real period of time. Nowadays it might be 5 years, but we've had 3 elections in as many years, so who really knows what's happening nowadays. But he has an odd term limit because he is forced to resign in 1974 due to the Watergate scandal, which we'll look at in a couple of slides' time. He's replaced by his vice president, Gerald Ford, so another Republican, and Ford only lasts that term limit. He's then replaced by Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, from 1977 to 1981. During this entire period, the Soviet Union is helmed by Brezhnev. Remember, he replaces Khrushchev after Khrushchev's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Brezhnev will die essentially from old age, but more like heart failure in 1982. The reason why I've spoken about the political parties of the American presidents, when we haven't really focused on that much, is that towards the end of the Cold War, it'll only be Republicans, and generally speaking, they'll have quite a hardline stance towards the Soviet Union. It's one of the reasons, perhaps, why the Cold War ends when it does in 1991. But during the period of détente, you have both Republicans and Democrats wanting to relax tensions between America and the Soviet Union. Before we look at what détente was like between the superpowers, we need to understand why they wanted détente, particularly in the 1970s rather than the 1960s or the 1980s. Each superpower had its own interests, relatively selfishly motivated, but both have a shared common goal as well. Obviously, the shared common goal was to reduce the threat of global annihilation. The Cuban Missiles Crisis of 1962 had proven that a few misunderstandings and a few hot-headed people could literally result in nuclear Armageddon. If you saw that TED video, you'll learn about the story of Vasily Arkhipov. He was almost able to start a nuclear war, but because he was unconvinced that America already had, he overruled his 2 other officers in the submarine. If they had launched nuclear weapons, America would have launched its nuclear weapons without Kennedy or Khrushchev being involved. All of that had proved that both sides needed to de-escalate the arms race. They needed to come to understandings and trust with the other side, otherwise who knows what could happen. In terms of America's specific interests, you kind of have the reverse point. Not only were they worried about a nuclear Armageddon, but the idea and the possibility of nuclear Armageddon had become more likely because the Soviet Union had increased its nuclear stockpile. In other words, they'd had so many nuclear weapons built in the last decade or so that they had essentially caught up with American production. That meant they were far less safe than they had been in the 1950s or the early 1960s. On top of that, the average American voter had realised this and considered it a very important thing to them. So, on an incredibly selfish note for people like Richard Nixon, if they don't deliver on the promises to reduce a nuclear war, they would be voted out at the next election. Again, more specifically for the Americans, we have the problem of the Vietnam War. We'll go into this in much greater detail in year 11, but essentially, America had gone into the Vietnam War in the mid 1960s, convinced that they would be able to beat these backward peasant farmers, which is how they would have seen them. Unfortunately, by the early 1970s, it became America's longest and most costly war, both in terms of the amount of time and investment in it, but also the physical and emotional toll. Your average American was convinced that they would win, and by the 1970s, most Americans wanted out. This showed that the Truman Doctrine had failed. Remember, every single US president had followed the Truman Doctrine, from Truman up until Nixon. They had promised to contain the threat of communism by military force if needed. It worked in places like Korea between 1950 and 1953, but it hadn't worked in places like Vietnam. So because the Truman Doctrine no longer seemed to hold, they would look for other ways to contain communism, either by coming to agreements or, in the case of Vietnam, kind of just letting it become communist because it was no longer worth the investment. From the Soviet Union's point of view, we've got the difference, we've got the opposite of what we'd said in the first point for America. America was concerned that the Soviet Union had caught up in the arms race, so wanted to cool tensions. From the Soviet Union's point of view, they were in a less threat of being wiped out, so they didn't need to be as aggressive in the arms race. We've got the issue of the economic struggles of the Soviet Union. Because they weren't capitalists, because they had a centralized system of planning, in other words, the Soviet government would basically tell most of Eastern Europe what to produce, how much it should cost, and then in a lot of cases simply take it from them. The ideas of capitalism weren't working. In a capitalist society, if you come up with a good idea or if you work hard, you can become a millionaire. Those incentives weren't working, and it'll be a major reason why Soviet Union collapses in 1991. But because its economy was struggling and because it was spending so much money in the arms race, overall people in the Soviet Union and the East Europeans as a whole were struggling. Finally, we have the idea of Chairman Mao, or the Chinese and Soviet relations. We've talked about the fact that Chairman Mao, the leader of China, criticized Khrushchev after the invasion of Hungary, and he criticized Brezhnev after the invasion of Czechoslovakia. By the late 1960s or early 1970s, China was a thoroughly developing power, but everyone knew it would be a major global player in X amount of years. Obviously, even today, China is still technically developing, even though it is a modern superpower. So the fact that a communist superpower might be growing closer with a capitalist superpower like America worried the communist superpower, the Soviet Union. Moving on to what happened during Détente. There's a suggested clip here for you, which is around 10 minutes long, just to kind of break up the monotony of these PowerPoint slides. It goes over some things which are too specific for us, but it does cover it in a good amount of detail. Use these headings using the video and the next few PowerPoint slides to help you. So we've got that earlier point of US and Chinese relations growing closer with each other. Then you've got SALT I in 1972, followed by the Watergate scandal, but you'll notice that's in brackets because it's less important. Then we've got the Helsinki Agreements, or the Helsinki Accords, or the Helsinki Final Act of 1975. We've got SALT II in 1979, and the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. Got a stretch and challenge for you to be thinking about as you're watching these clips or as you're going through these slides. Brezhnev had a reputation for being a hardliner. It was pretty much the main reason why he replaced Khrushchev, other than the fact that he was the main reason Khrushchev fell from power. If you think about his promises of dealing with capitalism or dealing with America, for most of his premiership, for all of the 1970s, he's working very closely with America. Do his actions show that he has changed, or perhaps there are other things going on? And think about his agreements outweighing his military interventions. In other words, he is the Soviet leader who invades Czechoslovakia, and he is the Soviet leader who invades Afghanistan in 1979. Given that against all of the agreements from Détente, which one is kind of more important for the Cold War, or which one is more important for Soviet-American relations? Again, that's the kind of stretch and challenge which I don't think has a clear right answer. But if you can come up with a logical, good, and well explained answer to that, it's the sort of thing which would really impress an examiner. Moving on to what happened during Détente. As always, we've got the names of our events at the top. If they're in red, it means it's absolutely crucial and you must have a good amount of detail for it for the exam. If it's in black, it'd be really, really good to know about it. And as always, there's so much more you can find out either in the textbook or from that video. So in 1972, we have the start of ping-pong diplomacy. If you're not sure what diplomacy means, it's the name for relations between two countries. So America and the Soviet Union have diplomatic relations. Argentina and the Netherlands can have diplomatic relations. But in 1971, America and China have no diplomatic relations. America had cut off all official communication with Communist China when it became communist in 1949. So for nearly 3 decades, there was no official communication between the greatest superpower in the world and what is looking up to be one of the greatest superpowers in the world. So Nixon had wanted to normalize relations, in other words, open up diplomatic ties. This started in January, with China inviting the US table tennis team, or the ping pong team, over to China. It's the first official visit from any American in 2.5 decades. In other words, an American could go to China, but they wouldn't be doing it as a representative of America. You might have seen Forrest Gump and remember the scene where he gets shot in the bum trying to save Bubba, and in hospital he picks up a table tennis bat, becomes insanely good at it, it goes to China and thrashes the Chinese team. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, not only because Forrest Gump wasn't a real person, but more importantly, because the Chinese team thrashed the Americans. Unfortunately, that didn't make for as good film, so it's a lie there because Americans are the best at everything, obviously. In any case, the next month in February, President Nixon visited Beijing. We've seen on this course already how important it is for two leaders of countries to meet with each other personally, ideally to get on personally, so that diplomatic relations can improve. We've seen that work well in the Tehran Conference of 1943, and we've seen that work badly in the Vienna and Paris summits leading up to the building of the Berlin Wall. America and China, however, did get on in 1972. A clear sign of that was a few months later when China gave Washington Zoo 2 pandas. Now you might think to yourself that's such a small thing, but a completely useless bit of information for you. China owns every single panda in the world. Because those pandas are indigenous to the area of China, any country which currently has a panda has only got it because China let them do it. Even if those 2 pandas in your zoo have a baby, that baby also belongs to China. So it's a weird way, even today, of China using an animal to increase diplomatic relations with another country. All of this worried the Soviet Union, as it meant that China could become America's ally. Now, the Cold War so far has been focused on America versus the Soviet Union, but the rising power of China presents 3 different options. They could ally with the Soviet Union, that would be the obvious choice because they're both communist. We've already seen multiple times where Mao Zedong has criticized the Soviet Union. They could ally themselves with America, an odd combination, but America would gladly welcome in a communist ally to defeat its most evil communist enemy, or China could simply remain neutral. So this is the Soviet Union's most likely wanted outcome. They want to try and soothe America so that it stops pursuing China so that China remains neutral. By the 1970s, the chances of China following the Soviet Union are essentially nil, but Brezhnev wanted to reduce any possibility of China becoming a bigger problem. This helps explain why later that year SALT I is signed. Now SALT stands for the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. So a treaty is an agreement. Strategic arms are things such as missiles, could be nuclear or just explosive, and limit obviously means to reduce. So SALT I is an agreement to reduce the amount of missiles that both countries have. There's many different agreements, but the second bullet point is the most important one. If you think about the idea of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, neither side would use nuclear missiles because the other side would use nuclear missiles. If MAD is a genuine possibility, then it's very natural for you to want to try and destroy the other side's nuclear missiles when they're launched. So both sides have developed anti-ballistic missiles. These are missiles that can shoot down missiles. This upsets the idea of MAD, because if you think that you can destroy the other side's nuclear missiles, then you're much more likely to launch your nuclear missiles. So one of the main ideas of SALT was to increase trust with each other by reducing the possibility of you being able to blow up their missiles. It's such a weird idea, but the idea is that if neither side could feel safe, they would have to trust each other. So both sides were only allowed 100 anti-ballistic missiles. They could potentially shoot down 100 nuclear missiles, but at this point, both of them have many thousands worth of nuclear missiles. To ensure that this would happen, both countries could use satellites to watch and make sure that each side was keeping to the treaties. In other words, they were giving the other country permission to spy on their anti-ballistic missile sites. So another weird example of, I don't trust you, but I'm going to show that I trust you by letting you spy on me, by letting you potentially harm me. All of this helped start new talks for SALT II, which will happen towards the end of the 1970s. And interestingly, Nixon and Brezhnev both declared a new era or a new age of peaceful coexistence. Remember, Khrushchev had introduced that idea near the start of his time as the leader of the Soviet Union. The idea was capitalism and communism, they are competitors, they are opponents, but they don't have to destroy each other. They compete in a friendly way. A clear example of this peaceful coexistence was the space link-up of 1975. A few years earlier, NASA and the Soviet version of NASA, Roscosmos, had begun to cooperate on space projects. This culminated in 1975 with US astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts meeting in the middle of space as it's orbiting the Earth and completing a symbolic handshake. Again, a completely useless bit of information, but the docking procedures between Apollo and Soyuz took months because there were intense negotiations about should the American side dock into the Soviet side or should the Soviet side dock into the American side, because manly things have to go into and female things have things go into them. There's so much machismo and awful masculine ideas here that eventually it was agreed that both sides would dock into each other and be docked into. These are genuine months of negotiations over an incredibly small thing. It easily increased the complexity and the cost by millions of dollars, but what's a couple of $1 million in the middle of the Cold War? In any case, both sides had signalled that they were willing to end the space race. According to the Americans, the space race ended a few years earlier with Neil Armstrong setting foot on the moon. But there's no reason why it had to stop at the moon. They could have set Mars as the next destination, I don't know, leaving the galaxy in hundreds and hundreds of years. But the point was, the rivalry was now friendly and cooperative. This would be a very important step to the International Space Station in the 1990s. There's a step in the middle called the Mir Space Station, which was Soviet and no longer exists, but the ISS is the one which everyone should know about nowadays. Moving on to another crucial one from the video, we have the Helsinki Agreement, again also called the Helsinki Accords, another word for agreement, or the Helsinki Final Act. In other words, this was the final outcome or the final agreement from Helsinki. Now, by this point, Nixon's Watergate scandal has resulted in him falling from power. He's had to resign, otherwise he would have been removed. Ford, in terms of his foreign policy, in terms of how he treated the Soviet Union, gave no difference. He wanted to continue doing what Nixon had done. So Helsinki in Finland was agreed as a fairly neutral point between all of these interested parties. So after 3 years of talks, 3 baskets of agreements were made. This includes almost every single European country, plus the USA and Canada. And when we say European, we are including the Soviet Union for those very pedantic people out there. They're called baskets of agreements because really there's like 10 or 12 different agreements, but they're grouped into 3 things to make it easier for everyone to understand. So the first idea is security. All of those countries accepted the current borders of European countries. If you think about the end of World War II, Poland had some of its land taken by the Soviet Union, and some of Germany was taken by Poland, and there were countless other different border adjustments. This had caused a state of paranoia, particularly in Eastern Europe, that those borders might change after 30 years. So part of the Helsinki Agreement would be that all countries that signed it agreed that the current borders of Europe will not be changed. The next basket of agreements concerned cooperation, and again this is very much in the idea of peaceful coexistence. All sides, in particular America and the Soviet Union, promised closer links both in terms of trading and the economy and science and culture. The final basket concerned human rights. All countries again agreed to respect human rights such as free speech and religion. From a British point of view, those things are obvious, those things are always going to be guaranteed. But from an Eastern European and Soviet point of view, those things are not always guaranteed. That's part of the reason why Hungary was invaded. That's part of the reason why Czechoslovakia was invaded. So America in particular would be very keen to make sure that the Soviet Union kept to its agreement in human rights. The Soviet Union, from its point of view, Brezhnev in particular, was thrilled that America had promised to respect Eastern European countries' borders. I don't understand why that was such a win for the Soviet Union, because by this point, America was happy with the borders of Eastern European countries, as were places like Britain. So both sides will leave the Helsinki Accords thinking that they've done well, but this will cause a much greater problem for East Europe later on. When we start looking at the final Soviet leader, a man by the name of Gorbachev, he will respect human rights in part because of the Helsinki Accords. He will respect human rights and the clamour and the call for these human rights, and that will help cause the downfall of the entire communist system. Finally, we have SALT II. So remember, SALT stands for the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. This would be much more ambitious, much larger than SALT I. It was signed by President Carter and Brezhnev in 1979. It would have limited the amount of nuclear vehicles. So these are things which can deliver nuclear bombs. So it could be one of those ICBMs, a missile which can go from one continent to another, or it could be a bomber plane. For example, the type which was dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima at the end of World War II. So it would limit those vehicles to 2,400 and ban even better ICBMs from being made. So it was signed by America, it was signed by the Soviet Union, but it was not ratified by America. It's a very important point here. Ratification is the formal approval process. So President Carter put his signature on a piece of paper, but it doesn't become law until Congress, America's parliament, also signed it into law. The reason why it was not ratified was because in between the signing and the ratification supposed to have happened, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. This showed, or at least this convinced many Americans, that the Soviet Union was not committed to Détente. As a result, Détente ended at the end of 1979 and a so-called Second Cold War had begun. Now, the exam board might call it a Second Cold War. We don't particularly like doing that because it suggests that Détente wasn't a Cold War. But really, the entire period from 1940s up to 1991, all of that is one Cold War. But look out for that weird Second Cold War term. So to finish off, we've got a couple of questions for you to be thinking about. We go back to this question, how far did the world relax in the 1970s? You'll always hear this idea of détente. Things are relaxing, tensions are relaxing, but they're not going away. So first of all, think about which was the biggest success during détente. I'd strongly recommend you focus on one of those red ones. So in particular, SALT I or the Helsinki Agreement. You're unlikely to argue the space link-up of 1975 or the Yom Kippur War of 1973. Think about which areas of tension still remain. If you think about those thematic answers in question 3, you've got political, economic, military, ideological. Which of those tensions are not really being resolved or not even being addressed? In particular, ideological tensions are not being addressed. That idea of peaceful coexistence says capitalism and communism can exist peacefully, which seems to go well until the invasion of Afghanistan, which we'll look at next lesson. Have a think about how much of Brezhnev's actions or the Soviet Union's actions have been influenced by US and Chinese relations improving. The second question there says, would détente have happened without it? I personally would argue it absolutely would, but it probably wouldn't have happened on the scale that it did. If you think Chinese and American relations are restored in 1972, and in the same year SALT I is signed, you could argue that SALT I wouldn't have been ambitious, or maybe it would have been a year or two later. With both of those, maybe SALT II never would have been signed, let alone ratified. And finally, think about to what extent did détente show that a Cold War was unnecessary? You might be quite ideological yourself here. You might be convinced that it shows that peaceful coexistence could work. I'm quite pessimistic myself. I don't think détente shows Cold War was unnecessary. Even though they could come to agreements, I don't think you could ever argue that a Cold War wouldn't happen because of it. Finally, we have a stretch and challenge I'd like everyone to try. You might have heard of the phrase papering over the cracks. Think about a house which is falling down, so real structural problems. Maybe there's been an earthquake, or maybe it's been neglected for 50 years, and there's big old cracks across the wall. You could take some wallpaper and paste over it with the strongest glue you could find. You wait a week, you wait a year, that wallpaper is going to rip, it's going to shred, the house is still going to fall down. That's what we mean by, is it only papering over the cracks? So again, this is the kind of question where there really is no straightforward answer. If you're more optimistic, you would show that actually détente was a genuine attempt to solve the Cold War. If you're more pessimistic, if you're more unlikely to see the good in the world, you might argue that actually détente was just a relaxation of tensions. Because those tensions weren't going away, they were always going to come back. So that is all of the main events in détente in the 1970s. As I've said before, there's a couple more events which we haven't gone through, like the Yom Kippur War or things such as that. If you want to find out more, I'll leave a couple more links in the Schoology page for you to find out.